3 civilizations. 1 engineering idea. Only one gets the credit. That number matters. 3 separate cultures built terraced rice paddies in mountainous terrain using nearly identical hydraulic logic. Identical slope ratios. Identical berm construction principles. Identical water routing methods carved into steep, unforgiving hillsides. Yet when the world talks about ancient rice terrace engineering, one name dominates every documentary, every UNESCO brochure, every high school textbook. It isn't Filipino, it never was. And the reason why tells you everything about how history gets written and who gets to write it. We're going to walk through this slowly because the story isn't just about rice paddies. It's about what happens when a civilization leaves no written record of its own genius, and another civilization shows up with paper, ink, and an administration that knows exactly how to colonize a narrative. The Ifugao people of northern Luzon didn't build the Banawe rice terraces as a monument. They built them to eat. Around 2,000 years ago, some estimates push further back, toward 3000 BCE, though dating remains contested among archaeologists. The Ifugao were carving irrigation channels into the Cordillera mountain range with wooden tools, bare hands, and a collective engineering knowledge passed down through oral tradition. No blueprints, no bureaucracy, just accumulated generational logic about water, gravity, and soil. Here's what most people don't register when they see photographs of those terraces. The water system isn't decorative, it's alive. The Ifugao constructed a network called Muyong, private forest plots owned by individual families specifically to protect watershed sources, feeding their terraces below. They weren't just farmers, they were managing a living system across roughly 10,000 square kilometers of mountain terrain. The Muyong system meant that deforestation upstream automatically destroyed your neighbor's rice yield. Downstream, conservation wasn't ideology, it was survival economics. They built accountability into the landscape itself. Stop for a second. Think about what that actually means for engineering history. A culture with 0 written language, 0 centralized government, and 0 access to metal tools designed a self-regulating ecological system that modern irrigation engineers still study. The International Rice Research Institute has formally documented the sophistication of Ifugao water management. UNESCO didn't give Banawe a World Heritage designation in 1995 out of charity. They gave it because their own hydrological experts couldn't fully explain how it still functions after 2 millennia. Now hold that image. Hold it carefully, because we need to pause the main story here and go somewhere else for a moment. There's a detail buried in early Chinese imperial records, specifically Tang Dynasty administrative texts from around the 7th to 10th centuries, that almost nobody outside academic circles ever reads. These records describe maritime trade networks extending deep into what Chinese historians called the Southern Islands. Those islands included the Philippine archipelago. Merchants, envoys, and monks traveled these routes regularly. The exchange wasn't purely commercial. Knowledge moved with cargo. Techniques traveled with traders. Agricultural methods spread the same way crop seeds spread. Slowly, quietly, without anyone filing a patent. By the time the Yunnan and Guangxi terrace systems of southern China began appearing in Chinese agricultural records, Ifugao terrace engineering had already been operational for centuries. The Honghe Hani rice terraces in Yunnan, the ones that get the lavish UNESCO attention, the glossy magazine spreads, the documentary slots, were built primarily between the 7th and 13th centuries CE. That's a gap of at least 1,000 years after Banawe, possibly much more. The Hani people themselves have their own rich cultural history and shouldn't be erased from this conversation. They built something extraordinary. The question isn't whether their terraces are impressive. The question is who learned from whom, and whether that learning ever got acknowledged. Chinese imperial historiography has a long and well-documented habit of absorbing peripheral innovations into a central narrative. Scholars have written extensively about how Southeast Asian achievements were routinely reframed in Chinese records as either gifts from Chinese civilization or natural developments among frontier peoples, being absorbed into imperial culture. It wasn't secret, it was policy. Return now to Banawe. Return to the Muyong forest plots and the stone berms and the channels cut into granite with wooden tools. When colonizers arrived in the Philippine archipelago in the 16th century, they did something that set the stage for 400 years of historical erasure. They wrote everything down. The problem is they wrote it from their own vantage point. Chroniclers documented Ifugao terrace agriculture with a kind of baffled admiration. Several early colonial texts noted the terraces were already ancient at the time of contact, too old for any living person to know their origin. The Spanish weren't trying to steal credit. They just weren't interested in giving it. Filipino agricultural genius got cataloged as a curiosity, not a civilization. American colonial administration after 1898 did something subtler and arguably more damaging. They elevated certain aspects of Philippine culture as primitive but charming. The Banawe terraces became a tourist attraction, a picturesque relic. They got photographed extensively. They ended up on the old 1,000 peso bill. Everyone agreed they were beautiful. Nobody particularly cared who built them, how, or why it mattered to engineering history. Charm neutralizes threat. A beautiful ruin doesn't challenge anyone's worldview. Meanwhile, China's 20th century cultural institutions were doing something entirely different with their terrace heritage. Systematic documentation, state-funded academic research, international academic partnerships, aggressive lobbying campaigns with substantial resources behind them. The Hongehani Terraces got their World Heritage designation in 2013, with a campaign that emphasized antiquity, indigenous knowledge, and hydraulic sophistication. Sound familiar? It should. It's the exact same argument that applies to Banawe with a century's head start. The gap in how these two sites get treated in global discourse isn't about the quality of the engineering. The gap is infrastructure. Documentation infrastructure. Political infrastructure. Diplomatic infrastructure. The Philippines had none of these working in its favor at the critical moments when prestige was being allocated. Now here's the part that changes how you read the whole story. There's a concept in the Ifugao worldview called Mumbaki, the ritual specialist who maintained not just religious ceremonies, but the encoded agricultural knowledge tied to those ceremonies. Planting rituals weren't superstition. They were mnemonic systems. The timing, the chants, the specific ritual sequences were carrying technical data about planting windows, water rotation schedules, and soil management practices. Oral civilizations don't write manuals. They sing them. They ritualize them. They make forgetting socially impossible by tying technical knowledge to spiritual identity. When missionaries converted Ifugao communities starting in the 17th and 18th centuries, they weren't just changing religion. They were altering the transmission of knowledge. The Mumbaki tradition didn't vanish overnight. Some of it survived in fragments. Some of it went underground. Some of it simply stopped being transmitted when the social structures that made transmission necessary collapsed. By the late 20th century, engineers studying Banao's irrigation system were encountering failures they couldn't explain, and realizing those failures corresponded exactly to communities where Mumbaki knowledge had been lost. The maintenance manual for a 2,000-year-old hydraulic system existed entirely inside human memory, and significant portions of that memory were gone. Think about the specific shape of that loss. You can reconstruct a physical structure from photographs and excavation. You can measure a stone berm. You can map a channel. But you cannot reconstruct the decision-making logic that a Mumbaki carried in their head about when to redirect water flow during a drought cycle. That knowledge is extinct. It will not come back. And the civilization that accumulated it over 2 millennia got called primitive by people who couldn't have built a single functioning terrace with all their tools and records. So what happens now? What's the cultural afterlife of this story? Filipino scholars and diaspora communities have spent the last 2 decades building something that should have been built a century earlier. an aggressive counter-narrative. Organizations like the Ifugao Terraces Commission have pushed hard for international recognition of the Banaue system's temporal precedents. Academic work from researchers at the University of the Philippines and partner institutions has been systematically documenting surviving Mumbaki knowledge before the remaining practitioners die. Well, there's a race happening right now. Most people don't know it's being run. The fan theory ecosystem around pre-colonial Philippine civilization has also exploded online. Filipino-American content creators, historians, and frankly just very passionate people on social media have been reconstructing Austronesian migration patterns, documenting the Baybayin script tradition, tracing trade networks that connected pre-Hispanic Luzon to Borneo, Java, and the Malay Peninsula. The academic community rolls its eyes sometimes at the more aggressive versions of this discourse. That's fair. Some of it overreaches. Some of it invents connections that aren't supportable. But the energy driving it is real, and it's producing genuine historical curiosity in a generation that was handed a colonial curriculum and told it was complete. Look, the Banaue Terraces have become something more than a UNESCO site or a tourist attraction. They've become a symbol of a specific kind of historical argument. The argument that civilization doesn't require writing, doesn't require empire, and doesn't require anyone else's permission to count as sophisticated. They exist as physical evidence against a worldview that measured human achievement by literacy and centralized power. They're still there. Well, still functioning, partially. Still beautiful in ways that have nothing to do with aesthetics, and everything to do with what it means to build something that outlasts every empire that ever tried to define you. 3 civilizations, 1 engineering idea. Only one gets the credit. You know now that the credit line was never about who built first or who built better. It was always about who controlled the documentation. The Ifugao didn't lose an engineering competition. They lost a paperwork war. They lost it because they encoded their knowledge in songs instead of scrolls, in rituals instead of registers, in the landscape itself rather than in the archives of an administration. Now pay attention. The terraces are still there. The songs are mostly gone. The archives still belong to someone else. And the only way any of this changes is if enough people decide the story is worth telling. Loudly, repeatedly, and with the kind of stubborn specificity that makes erasure difficult. That work is happening. It started long before this video. It'll continue long after. The only question is whether you're paying attention.